In the small northern Ontario town of Marathon, where maple trees frame Lake Superior's steel-gray waters, Thomas Reed lived a carefully constructed double life. To his neighbors, he was the perfect family man, a devoted husband to Mary Ann, loving father to 11-year-old Lily, and the kind of helpful neighbor who fixed broken pipes and offered assistance without being asked. What the community didn't know was that Thomas Reed was also one of Canada's most methodical serial killers, a man who had spent 23 years perfecting the art of murder while maintaining an impeccable facade of normalcy. The story begins on a crisp September morning when Thomas first encountered David McKinnon outside Hartley's General Store. David, a recently divorced man in his early 40s, had just moved north from Sudbury, seeking solitude and a fresh start after a brutal divorce that had destroyed his trust in people and left him financially devastated. As David approached Thomas seeking directions to a local mechanic, Thomas immediately recognized something that had become his specialty over 2 decades of killing: vulnerability. With the practiced eye of a predator, Thomas cataloged David's potential as a victim. The man was isolated, approximately 42 years old, 5'10", with the soft build of someone adjusting to major life changes. Most importantly, David possessed that particular loneliness Thomas had learned to identify, the look of someone starting over, disconnected from support networks, desperate for human connection. David had purchased an old fishing cabin on remote Clearwater Lake, planning to renovate it and work as a consultant. Perfect isolation, minimal local connections, and the kind of trusting nature that would welcome help from a friendly neighbor. Thomas's selection of David McKinnon wasn't random or impulsive. It was the culmination of 23 years of experience in choosing, cultivating, and destroying human lives. 17 men had already disappeared across northern Ontario, their deaths attributed to the harsh wilderness that could claim lives through thin ice, dense forests, or simple misfortune. The authorities had never connected these disappearances because Thomas operated with the methodical precision of an engineer, varying his methods, locations, and timing while maintaining perfect cover as a respected community member. Thomas's approach to David represented the perfection of techniques he had refined over decades. Rather than rushing toward violence, he understood that the most successful kills required patience, trust-building, and psychological manipulation that would make the victim complicit in his own destruction. The relationship began with genuine helpfulness. When Thomas found David struggling with roof repairs on his deteriorating cabin, he climbed up to fix the problem professionally and competently. This wasn't performance. Thomas was genuinely skilled at construction work, and his assistance was real and valuable. The key was that every act of kindness served a dual purpose: solving David's problems while gathering intelligence about his vulnerabilities, routines, and psychological state. Over shared coffee and conversation, Thomas learned that David's divorce had been catastrophic. His wife's affair with his business partner had not only ended his marriage, but destroyed his professional relationships and depleted his finances. David had fled north seeking isolation, but the solitude he'd craved was becoming oppressive. He was struggling with basic rural survival skills, had no local connections, and was beginning to question whether he could survive his first northern winter. Thomas recognized these signs as the perfect foundation for dependency. He began positioning himself as David's lifeline, the experienced local who could teach him to navigate harsh winters, the skilled craftsman who could make his cabin livable, and most importantly, the friend who could provide the human connection David desperately needed. The cultivation process was masterful in its subtlety. Thomas never appeared too eager to help or overly interested in David's affairs. Instead, he created natural opportunities for contact while allowing David to be the one reaching out for assistance. When David's heating system failed during an early snowstorm, Thomas was there with space heaters and expertise. When David ran out of firewood during a cold snap, Thomas appeared with a chainsaw and experience. When David faced frozen pipes, Thomas knew exactly how to solve the problem. Each crisis was real. Thomas didn't need to create artificial emergencies when David's inexperience with northern living provided plenty of genuine problems. But each solution deepened David's dependence and gratitude while providing Thomas with detailed knowledge of his target's routines, psychology, and vulnerabilities. Perhaps most cunningly, Thomas integrated David into his family life. David became a regular dinner guest at the Reed household, developing genuine affection for Lily and authentic friendship with Mary Ann. These domestic interactions served multiple purposes. They reinforced Thomas's image as a devoted family man, provided David with the human connection he craved, and created witnesses who would later testify to Thomas's kindness toward the victim. During these family dinners, Thomas could observe David's emotional responses, gauge his psychological state, and subtly gather information while appearing to simply enjoy neighborly conversation. David spoke openly about his loneliness, his financial struggles, and his growing doubts about his decision to move north. Every revelation was mentally cataloged by Thomas as intelligence that would be useful in the final phase of his plan. By late October, Thomas had achieved exactly what he'd been working toward. David McKinnon had become completely dependent on his assistance for survival, emotionally invested in their friendship, and trusting enough to accept help without question. David's isolation was nearly complete. Apart from Thomas's family, he had minimal connections to the community and no regular contact with friends or family from his previous life. The approaching winter provided perfect cover for what Thomas had planned. Northern Ontario winters were legendary for their brutality, and every year claimed lives from people who underestimated the dangers. David, as a newcomer still learning to navigate harsh conditions, would be exactly the type of victim such weather would logically claim. Thomas had spent weeks studying the route from David's cabin to town, identifying the perfect location for a staged accident. There was a section of road about 3 miles from the cabin where the route crossed Clearwater Lake, a treacherous stretch even in good weather, where ice could be unpredictable and landmarks obscured by snow. Thomas had surveilled this area extensively, noting weak spots where warm springs fed the lake from below, creating areas where ice remained dangerously thin. The plan Thomas developed was elegant in its simplicity and plausibility. During a severe storm, David would need help, probably with heating failure or emergency transportation to town. Thomas would respond as any good neighbor would, offering assistance that would require traveling the dangerous ice road. During the journey, they would have an accident where the ice gave way. David's body would be found days later when the storm cleared, another tragic victim of winter's indifference. The beauty of the plan lay in its believability. Every winter, Northern Ontario claimed lives from people who took risks in dangerous conditions. David's death would seem like a cautionary tale rather than a crime, and Thomas would be remembered as the hero who had tried to help his neighbor but couldn't save him. The massive Arctic storm system that meteorologists predicted would bring blizzard conditions to Marathon was exactly what Thomas had been waiting for. Wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour and snowfall totals reaching 2 feet would create perfect conditions for a deadly accident, while providing natural cover that would destroy most physical evidence. On the Tuesday before the storm's arrival, Thomas received David's expected call. The generator at David's cabin had failed, his space heaters couldn't maintain adequate temperature, and ice was forming on the interior walls. David was facing a potentially fatal situation without immediate assistance. Thomas's response was perfectly calibrated, concern mixed with practical assessment of the dangerous conditions. He invited David to stay at their home until the storm passed, an offer that David accepted with grateful relief. This invitation would be remembered by Mary Ann and Lily as evidence of Thomas's kindness in providing shelter to a friend in need. David's arrival at the Reed house Wednesday morning carrying a duffel bag and expressing profound gratitude, set up the final phase perfectly. The family spent a cozy day making cookies, building blanket forts, and splitting firewood, domestic activities that reinforced the image of kindness, while Thomas monitored weather conditions for the optimal moment to execute his plan. As the storm intensified Wednesday evening, reaching dangerous velocities with near-zero visibility, Thomas prepared to implement his final strategy. At 11 p.m., he made a crucial phone call using an untraceable prepaid cell phone he'd purchased weeks earlier. Disguising his voice and claiming to be Jake Morrison from the local garage, Thomas told David that Morrison's wife had gone into labor early and they needed immediate help getting to the hospital because their truck wouldn't start. The poor connection created by the storm made the deception easier, and David, warm and comfortable, but still possessing a good man's instinct to help others in genuine emergencies, immediately wanted to assist. When David called Thomas to ask for help with this emergency, Thomas played his role perfectly, showing initial reluctance due to the dangerous conditions, then agreeing when David appealed to his sense of family duty by asking what Thomas would want if it were Mary Ann in labor. This exchange would be remembered as evidence that both men were heroes willing to risk their lives to help someone in need. As Thomas and David headed out into the blizzard, Thomas felt the familiar calm that came over him at the moment of implementation. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered. The storm had transformed familiar roads into an alien landscape where headlights barely penetrated swirling snow and wind rocked even Thomas's sturdy truck. David's nervousness about the conditions was exactly what Thomas had anticipated. When Thomas explained they would take a shortcut across Clearwater Lake to save time, David accepted the explanation despite his discomfort. Thomas positioned this route as necessary expertise. The main road would be drifted shut, but this lake crossing would cut 20 minutes off their journey. What Thomas didn't mention was that this route passed through some of the most isolated terrain in the area, with no cell phone coverage and weather conditions that would prevent any witnesses. The lake crossing itself was normally dangerous, with weak spots where springs kept ice unstable even in the coldest weather. About halfway across the lake, at a location Thomas had carefully selected during his reconnaissance, he began implementing the sequence he had rehearsed mentally dozens of times. As David leaned forward to check his phone's GPS, Thomas struck him in the temple with a small sap, hard enough to cause unconsciousness and disorientation, but not immediately fatal trauma that would be inconsistent with drowning. With David unconscious, Thomas quickly stopped the truck over one of the weak ice spots he had identified. He shut off the engine, pocketed the keys, and used rope to bind David's ankles, not tightly enough to leave obvious marks, but securely enough to ensure the man would be unable to swim effectively when he regained consciousness in freezing water. Working efficiently in the howling wind, Thomas used an ice chisel to weaken the ice around the truck's front wheels. This took nearly 10 minutes of careful work, but Thomas was patient. This was the culmination of months of planning, and precision was essential. After moving David to the driver's seat to make it appear he had been driving when the accident occurred, Thomas restarted the truck and moved it forward slowly until the weakened ice gave way with explosive sound and the vehicle plunged into the black water below. The shock of freezing lake water rushing into the cab was intense, but expected. As the truck tilted forward and began sinking, Thomas could hear David beginning to stir, perfect timing that would allow the victim to experience the terror of drowning while being unable to escape. David's panic upon regaining consciousness was exactly what Thomas had anticipated. The cold water and head injury made David's movements clumsy and ineffective, while the rope around his ankles prevented any possibility of swimming to safety. Thomas played his role as fellow victim perfectly, shouting about the ice giving way and making it appear he was also struggling to escape. But he had practiced this scenario mentally countless times and knew exactly when to make his move. As the water rose to their chests, and David realized his legs were bound, Thomas made his carefully planned escape. He dove down, swam out through the driver's side window he had quietly opened while David was unconscious, and surfaced beside the sinking truck. Behind him, David's increasingly desperate shouts carried clearly across the frozen lake. Fear, confusion, and finally terrible understanding as he realized this was no accident. But Thomas was already using the rope he had anchored to a sturdy tree, pulling himself to safety while David drowned in the sinking vehicle. The entire sequence from ice breakthrough to David's death took less than 5 minutes, quick, efficient, and entirely consistent with the kind of winter accident that claimed lives annually in northern Ontario. Thomas's preparation extended far beyond the murder itself. He had cached dry clothes and emergency supplies in a waterproof bag hidden among trees on the shoreline, allowing him to change quickly despite the brutal cold. Using a small shovel, he scattered fresh snow over areas where he had entered and exited the water, eliminating obvious signs of his escape route that the continuing storm would completely obscure. The rope he'd used for escape was retrieved and hidden, ensuring investigators would find no obvious means by which he could have survived the sinking truck. Using his ice chisel, Thomas created the appearance of desperate attempts to rescue David, chipping at the ice around the hole in a way that would suggest he had tried frantically to reach the drowning man. When Thomas was satisfied that the scene was properly prepared, he positioned himself about 50 yards from the hole and used a rock to give himself a glancing head wound, enough to create convincing trauma without serious injury. Then he lay down in the snow to wait for discovery as the sole survivor of a tragic accident. The story Thomas had prepared was already perfectly formed. The desperate attempt to help a neighbor whose wife was in labor, the treacherous ice road taken to save time, the terrible moment when the ice gave way, and his own desperate but unsuccessful attempts to save his friend. Everyone would believe him because Thomas Reed was exactly the kind of man who would risk his life to help someone in need. Search and rescue teams found Thomas at dawn, unconscious in the snow after 6 hours in sub-zero conditions, a genuinely life-threatening situation that added credibility to his survivor status. Constable Sarah Matthews of the Ontario Provincial Police discovered him half-frozen, and Thomas's first words upon regaining consciousness were concerns about David's safety. At Thunder Bay Hospital, Thomas was treated for hypothermia and a mild concussion that were entirely consistent with his cover story. His condition was genuinely dangerous. He had, after all, spent hours in brutal conditions, and Dr. Jennifer Park found nothing suspicious in his medical presentation. Inspector Mike Kowalski, a 20-year OPP veteran, took Thomas's initial statement and found the account entirely believable. Thomas described the emergency call from Jake Morrison, though Morrison would later have no memory of making such a call, his reluctance to venture out in dangerous weather overcome by duty to help someone in crisis, and the tragic moment when the ice gave way beneath their truck. Thomas's performance as a grief-stricken survivor was flawless. He spoke of David's disorientation after hitting his head during the plunge, of his own desperate attempts to reach his friend, and of his guilt at being unable to save a good man who had died trying to help a stranger. Every detail was consistent with accidental death, and Thomas's emotional responses appeared entirely genuine. The physical investigation initially supported Thomas's account. Divers located the truck in 40 feet of water, exactly where Thomas said it would be, and the hole in the ice was consistent with a vehicle breaking through suddenly. David McKinnon's body was found trapped in the driver's seat, and the scene appeared to confirm a tragic winter accident. Marathon's response to the tragedy was exactly what Thomas had anticipated. The community rallied around him as a hero who had survived a terrible accident while trying to save his neighbor. Marianne and Lily were at his hospital bedside, expressing relief at his survival and grief for David's loss. At David's funeral, Thomas delivered a moving eulogy about his friend's courage and kindness. speaking of David's willingness to venture into dangerous weather to help a stranger. The mourners saw Thomas as a grieving friend who had done everything possible to save David's life. No one suspected the man delivering this heartfelt tribute was also David's killer. However, the investigation took a crucial turn when Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the regional coroner, discovered rope tied around David's ankles during the autopsy. The rope was thin but strong, knotted in a way that would have made removal impossible for someone disoriented and hypothermic underwater. The knots were methodical and precise, clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing. This discovery immediately transformed the investigation from routine accident examination to homicide inquiry. If David McKinnon had been murdered, then Thomas Reed's story was a lie, and the community hero was actually the primary suspect. Inspector Kowalski assembled a specialized team, including Detective Ray Santos from Thunder Bay Major Crime Unit and behavioral analysis specialists, to re-examine every aspect of the case with fresh eyes. The second interview with Thomas was conducted under very different circumstances than the first. While maintaining the pretense of seeking his help to understand what happened to his friend, the investigators were now treating him as a potential murder suspect. Thomas, recognizing the shift in tone, knew he needed to be more careful than ever. When presented with evidence of the rope around David's ankles, Thomas displayed what appeared to be genuine surprise and confusion, suggesting the rope might have been emergency equipment from his truck that became tangled around David's legs during the chaos of the sinking. His explanation was plausible if improbable, and his reaction seemed authentic. When investigators revealed that Jake Morrison claimed he hadn't made the emergency call that brought them out that night, Thomas appeared genuinely confused, suggesting David might have been mistaken about who called or that someone else had called claiming to be Morrison. These responses demonstrated Thomas's skill at providing innocent explanations for suspicious evidence while maintaining psychological credibility. However, the investigators' suspicions were deepening, especially when forensic analysis revealed additional troubling details. Dr. Marcus Webb from the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service found that David showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head that occurred before he entered the water, an injury inconsistent with hitting his head during the vehicle's descent through ice. The blow had been struck while David was in an air environment, suggesting someone had attacked him before the truck went through the ice. The comprehensive forensic search of Clearwater Lake that Inspector Kowalski ordered proved to be the breakthrough that would ultimately destroy Thomas's carefully constructed defense. Specialized divers and underwater metal detectors revealed evidence that Thomas's accident had been meticulously planned. The first significant discovery was an ice chisel buried in mud 30 yards from where the truck had gone through, a tool that could have been used to deliberately weaken the ice. More damning was a waterproof bag hidden among shoreline rocks, weighted down but connected by nearly invisible fishing line to the accident site. Inside the bag were dry clothes, emergency supplies, and rope identical to what had bound David's ankles, clear evidence that someone had prepared an escape route and survival cache before the accident occurred. Sonar mapping revealed tool marks in the ice directly above where the truck had sunk, scratches and gouges suggesting someone had deliberately weakened the ice structure before the vehicle broke through. This evidence proved beyond doubt that David McKinnon's death had been carefully planned murder, not a tragic accident. Thomas Reed had prepared every detail of the killing, including his own survival and escape. Armed with this new evidence, investigators obtained warrants to search Thomas's home and workshop. When police vehicles arrived at the Reed house on that Friday morning, Thomas maintained his composure even as his carefully constructed world began collapsing. The search revealed tools that could have weakened ice, rope similar to what had bound David, and waterproof bags like the one found in the lake. But these items weren't unusual for a contractor working in northern Ontario, and Thomas had logical explanations for every piece of equipment. The crucial moment came when investigators discovered Thomas's locked filing cabinet in his workshop. The cabinet contained the documents that would expose him not just as David McKinnon's killer, but as one of the most prolific serial killers in Canadian history. However, when asked to open the cabinet, Thomas suddenly collapsed with what appeared to be a massive heart attack brought on by investigation stress. The performance was flawless, buying him precious time while preventing investigators from accessing the damning evidence locked inside. At the hospital, Dr. Jennifer Park found Thomas's cardiac symptoms consistent with acute stress-related distress. The heart attack generated sympathy, provided medical justification for any stress-related behavior, and most importantly, prevented immediate access to the filing cabinet that would have destroyed him. Recognizing that investigators would eventually access his hidden files, Thomas developed a desperate strategy to control the narrative. Rather than wait for the evidence to be discovered, he would appear to cooperate by opening the cabinet himself while managing what information was revealed. When investigators returned the following Monday, Thomas agreed to open the filing cabinet, claiming he wanted to cooperate fully. Inside were meticulously organized files documenting not just David McKinnon's murder, but 17 other killings spanning more than 2 decades. However, Thomas had prepared a sophisticated alternative explanation. Rather than allowing investigators to discover the full scope of his crimes, he presented a partial confession that acknowledged David's death while portraying it as an isolated incident motivated by personal conflict rather than serial killing. Thomas claimed that he and David had been having a secret affair and that David's threat to reveal their relationship to Marianne had triggered a moment of panic. According to this story, David's death had been accidental, the result of a fight during which David fell and hit his head, and Thomas had staged the truck accident to cover up what he feared would be seen as murder. This confession was brilliant in its construction. Thomas admitted to staging an accident and allowing David to die, but portrayed himself as a coward and adulterer rather than a calculated serial killer. More importantly, he provided explanations for the physical evidence that didn't require accepting him as someone capable of multiple murders. The fictional affair provided motive for the cover-up, explained Thomas's detailed planning. He claimed he had initially intended to fake both their deaths to avoid scandal, and portrayed David's death as tragedy born of personal weakness rather than predatory calculation. While Thomas's confession strategy initially limited the charges he faced, the discovery of his extensive files had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across Canada. Corporal Janet Brooks from the RCMP Missing Persons Task Force had been tracking unsolved disappearances across northern Ontario for years, and Thomas Reed's name had appeared in connection with multiple cases. Brooks's investigation revealed that Thomas had been linked to at least 6 missing persons cases dating back 15 years. Men between 35 and 50 who were transient or socially isolated, all disappearing from communities where Thomas was known to have worked or visited. The collaboration between local police and RCMP expanded rapidly as the true scope of Thomas's crimes became apparent. The filing cabinet contained documentation for 17 separate murders, each meticulously planned and executed over 23 years. The files included victim profiles, location maps, timeline analyses, and post-incident reports written with chilling clinical detachment. Perhaps most horrifying was the level of detail Thomas had maintained. He had documented everything from initial victim selection to body disposal methods, tracked news coverage of disappearances, monitored police investigations, and analyzed his own performance to improve future techniques. The David McKinnon file revealed that Thomas had begun planning the murder within days of their first meeting, and that every act of kindness had been a calculated step in an elaborate killing scheme. Further search of the Reed property revealed the full extent of Thomas's sophisticated operation. Hidden behind false walls in the basement workshop was a killing room complete with restraints, soundproofing, and drainage systems, a space designed specifically for torture and murder that had been disguised as an ordinary workspace. Forensic analysis revealed blood traces from multiple victims, confirming that Thomas had used his own home as a murder site while his wife and daughter lived upstairs, completely unaware of the horrors occurring beneath them. Most disturbing was Thomas's trophy collection, personal items taken from each victim and carefully preserved like museum pieces. David McKinnon's wallet was there alongside mementos from 16 other men who had trusted Thomas Reed and paid for that trust with their lives. Thomas Reed's trial became a media sensation, drawing attention from across North America as the scope of his crimes was revealed. Crown Attorney Catherine Morrison faced the daunting task of presenting evidence from 18 separate murders to a jury struggling to comprehend how someone could maintain a facade of normalcy while systematically killing for over 2 decades. Defense attorney Michael Chen attempted to argue mental illness, presenting Thomas as a deeply disturbed individual whose fractured psychology had allowed him to compartmentalize normal family life from homicidal behavior. However, Thomas undermined this strategy by maintaining his innocence regarding the serial murders while acknowledging only David McKinnon's death. Thomas insisted that the detailed murder plans found in his workshop were fiction, elaborate fantasy scenarios he had written but never acted upon. His explanations for physical evidence were so implausible they bordered on insulting the jury's intelligence, yet he delivered them with such matter-of-fact certainty that the overall effect was deeply unsettling. The most disturbing moment came when Thomas was shown crime scene photographs of his basement killing room. Rather than displaying horror or remorse, he commented approvingly on the craftsmanship of the soundproofing installation, as if evaluating construction work rather than confronting evidence of his crimes. When prosecutors read passages from Thomas's detailed crime files, clinical descriptions of victim selection, trust cultivation, and disposal techniques, Thomas sat motionless, showing no more emotion than he might display while reviewing blueprints. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 18 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Robert Hamilton sentenced Thomas to 18 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole for 25 years each, effectively ensuring he would never be released. The revelation that Thomas Reed was a serial killer devastated the marathon community and shattered assumptions about human nature. The house where he had planned 18 murders while maintaining the facade of devoted family man remained empty, too tainted by association with his crimes for anyone to purchase. Mary Ann Reed, learning that her husband was not just an adulterer, but a mass murderer, struggled to reconcile 16 years of marriage with the reality of his crimes. Her book, Living with a Monster, A Wife's Story, explored the impossible question of which memories were genuine and which were performances in Thomas's elaborate deception. Their daughter Lily, now 16 and using her mother's maiden name, had no contact with her father and was reportedly doing well in therapy, though the psychological impact of learning her devoted father was a serial killer would affect her permanently. Detective Ray Santos, whose investigation had exposed Thomas's crimes, retired to write about the case and consult on similar investigations. The Reed case had challenged his understanding of human evil and the ability of monsters to hide in plain sight. Thomas himself was transferred to maximum security imprisonment, spending 23 hours daily in solitary confinement. In interviews with behavioral analysts studying his case, he remained unrepentant about his crimes while expressing apparent genuine regret about losing his family. Most disturbing was Thomas's continued inability to connect his dual lives. He insisted he had been a good father and husband who had simply made some unrelated poor professional choices, seeming genuinely puzzled when interviewers pointed out that he had killed people in his basement while his daughter slept upstairs. The case of Thomas Reed remains one of the most studied examples of successful criminal psychopathy. A man who maintained perfect normalcy while committing carefully planned murders for over 2 decades. His success had been enabled by his methodical victim selection, his patience in building trust before striking, and his ability to compartmentalize completely different aspects of his identity. More troubling was the recognition that Reed's crimes had been facilitated by the isolation and transient nature of northern communities, where his carefully chosen victims were unlikely to be missed quickly. The case prompted improvements in missing persons investigations and interjurisdictional communication, though these changes came too late for Reed's 18 victims. The families of Reed's victims formed a support group to process grief and closure, while the remains of 16 victims were recovered using information Thomas provided in exchange for improved prison conditions. Thomas's cooperation in locating bodies was his final manipulation, attempting to portray himself as helpful even while serving multiple life sentences. In his prison cell, Thomas continued to believe he was a good man who had made unfortunate choices. He maintained the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed him to function as both loving family man and methodical killer, planning appeals he would never win and writing letters to family members who would never read them. The perfect neighbor had finally been revealed as the monster he had always been. But the questions raised by his case, about the nature of evil, the fragility of trust, and the possibility that anyone might be hiding unthinkable secrets, would continue to haunt those who had known him. Thomas Reed's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it comes disguised as the helpful neighbor who fixes your roof, the devoted father who reads bedtime stories, the respected community member who offers assistance without being asked. The most dangerous predators are often those who have perfected the art of appearing perfectly normal while hiding depths of calculated malevolence that challenge our fundamental assumptions about human nature. In the end, 18 men lost their lives to Thomas Reed's elaborate psychological game, their deaths serving as grim testament to the fact that sometimes the person we trust most completely is the one we should fear above all others. The perfect neighbor's final hunt had ended, but the damage he caused would echo through generations of families who would never fully recover from trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. The monster had been caught, the victims found, and justice served. But the terrifying truth remained that Thomas Reed had succeeded for 23 years precisely because he was everything his community believed a good man should be. That contradiction between appearance and reality stands as perhaps the most chilling aspect of his story, a reminder that evil can hide behind the most convincing mask of ordinary human decency.